Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Monday, April 29th, 2024. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. And with me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist and American Enterprise Institute senior fellow Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, Christine's fellow senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, our friend Adam White. Hi, Adam. How are you?
Hi, John. Great to be here.
Okay, so Adam, we want to delve deeply into the Supreme Court's arguments on the Trump immunity case. But before we do that, I guess we really do have to take in the hijinks and the tomfoolery and just utterly delightful Reichstag fire behavior taking over many of America's campuses. Not many, actually quite a few, given the fact that there are like 280,000 colleges in the United States, 279,500 of which you've never heard of. So, in fact, the number of campuses that have encampments and all that is actually relatively small. I made up that number just in case anybody wants to quibble or is a little too literal. So the number of campuses that are going through this turmoil is actually rather small in the teens. But of course, outsized in importance because of the locations of these encampments at Harvard, at Yale, obviously at Columbia, USC has one now, and UCLA had one or has one, and Emory has one, and different approaches are being taken by different.
Well, I was going to add, you know who doesn't have one? Arizona State University, which enlisted its frat bros to help clear the encampment, which I encourage all other schools to do. Like, this is a very useful activity for fraternities.
Now, for those of us who don't necessarily have a particularly favorable opinion of frat bros, because we didn't go to schools with frats and have our image made up entirely by the bad fraternities in Animal House and Revenge of the Nerds. This puts me in mind of something I was discussing the other day with somebody about how in 1938 and 1939 in New York, when the German-American Bund was staging pro-Nazi rallies in Yorkville and at Madison Square Garden in Manhattan, the police turned a blind eye to the fact that gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Murder Incorporated arranged gangs to go in with baseball bats and smash the heads of the Nazis. So I am not saying that frat bros are Nazis, but I think the application of extrajudicial force, let's say in these cases, it has interesting parallels.
I'm sure they were deputized.
They were implicitly deputized, and of course, this just shows that sometimes you need to set a thief to catch a thief, and you need to set a bro to catch a communist bro. And it was delightful to see. At Emory, a couple of professors got arrested, and we saw this footage. It's like, can you believe they're arresting this anthropology professor and this sociology professor? And then it turns out, at least one of these cases, the professor in question hit a cop on the head as he was trying to arrest somebody else. So he hurled on her and grabbed her instead. And then she went, "Help, help, I'm being oppressed." We will have to go into greater detail on the absolutely shocking behavior of the Heideggers of 2024. These professors who are siding with, barbaric, anti-civilizational evil because they love blood. But I will decline to go into that for the moment. Christine, you haven't been on in a couple of days. How are you feeling about the campus performed?
Yeah. Two observations. One, with two kids about to go off to college in the fall, I'm watching pretty closely, including one actually to Emory's campus. I think some presidents of these universities are doing much better than others at trying to very quickly respond, to keep everybody informed, to say these are the rules, and if you violate them, this will happen. And others are just failing miserably, but they all do seem to have a posture that worries me, which is to succumb to demand. So one of the things over the weekend is that a lot of the protesters at Columbia, for example, and some of the other Ivies are demanding amnesty for any charges that might be held against them, or any sort of, they don't want anything on their record because they want to go to McKinsey and be a consultant, or go to whatever they want to do afterwards with no record of the courage of their so-called convictions. And I think that's very telling. Because when forced, there were a couple of universities where I think at University of Florida, there were a couple of places in Florida where they said, okay, if you do this, you're going to be suspended and you can't come back for a year, and there'll be a mark on your record. Half of those kids immediately stopped protesting because they have their future in mind. And that's probably a wise choice for them. But one of the things that's shocking to me is that these administrators are not giving any they're implicitly giving credence to a lot of the messaging of these protesters. They're not saying, oh, you have a free speech right and it's fine. They're saying, oh, we understand how you feel. We understand your grievance on behalf of the Palestinian people. And in doing that, they really are aiding and abetting a kind of toxic anti-Semitism right now, when all they should be doing is calling that out, because that, unfortunately, is the root of a lot of these protesters. Setting aside the ones who have no idea what they're actually protesting, which we did see in interviews are a fair number, or the ones who are macrameing in their peace circle, like on Columbia's little I forget what they call it. What's their
drum
little zone?
circle? I don't know.
Yeah, drum circles and macrameing and all the crafts and stuff they're doing. Yeah. They are doing that, and the news reports, that's the second thing that struck me about over the weekend. The news reports about these student activists have been generally flattering. They shouldn't be. They should be talking about, they are deliberately ignoring the anti-Semitic rhetoric that is a consistent feature of these protests. And I think that's really a dereliction of their duty as journalists.
I mean, I think important point. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, I just think that the fact that the professors are now involved and getting arrested, it's only appropriate because this is where these students got these ideas to begin with. I mean, there are many other circumstances that I think contributed to this moment. I think even the sort of residual effects and the lessons of the pandemic included. But the ideas, the intellectual stuff of this protest came straight from these classrooms. So it would make perfect sense that the professors are involved.
Right. Well, people of our age, so we have varying ages here on this panel. I'm in my 60s. Abe is in his 50s. Christine pretends to be in her 50s, but I don't believe.
I'm 50 years old.
Yeah, well, you're not in your sixth decade yet. I'm youthening you. And Adam, I believe, is in his 40s. So those of us who remember life in college and maybe in graduate school, we're looking at this and saying, why aren't the professors? I mean, they are destroying the traditions of the university. And when we went to school, there were blah and this and that and the other thing, right? And we are like yesterday's number. These are not the professors that we had. These are not the administrators that we had. Nobody, first of all, is scared of them, as we were. It's like if you got a note from the bursar's office that you were 2 days late on your tuition, it was terrifying. They would take away your check cashing privileges at the administration building, which was the only way you could get cash when I was in school, that kind of thing. And you were scared as a student of the good opinion of your professors and of the a possibility that the administration would come down on you for something or other if you were caught drinking in your room, or if you were, making a ruckus on campus or something like that. And so that really hasn't been the case for 3 decades or more. I graduated 40 years ago. And so I am thinking about a different university. The professoriate and the administrators at the major colleges of the school chose the student body that is doing this because they wanted activists. They wanted people who were involved, edgy, and full of, effervescence. Remember the word effervescent from the lawsuit brought by the Asian American kids against Harvard, that one of the standards that was keeping their numbers low was that they were low on the effervescence scale. So Kiami James at Columbia got a lot of effervescence. He'd like to murder every Zionist. Boy, that he pops, let me tell you, because in high school, as we discovered, if you did a little research over the weekend, he did the same crap in high school as a kid at Boston Latin who got himself on some student faculty politician committees in Boston, where he became a protege of Representative Ayanna Pressley's and said, well, of course I hate white people, but ... It's like, great, let's have him at Columbia, a 16-year-old, 17-year-old who says he hates all white people. That's great. Congratulations. And let's bring on somebody who says he hates all black people just as a counterbalance. They're equally effervescent, in my opinion. This is the student body, or part of the student body, that they chose. And Professor, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that is the test. So I was talking to a friend over the weekend. The test is, if you substitute the word black or African American every time you see a sign or hear a chant that says Jew or Zionist, and you're comfortable with a university campus environment that says go back to Africa, death to all Africans. Like, I mean, if you're comfortable with that, if you think that's within the range of normal speech, which is totally acceptable, then great, then go ahead and no one should be complaining about these protests. But we know that the double standard in effect here is so noxious and so obvious to us, but being so completely ignored in the discussion of how to deal with these students. This would never be acceptable. Or even what if they were conservative students for Trump who were setting up these camps and saying, we're not going to budge until our demands are met? This is not acceptable, except for the fact that it is targeting Israel and criticizing the Jews. That's why it's acceptable to this professoriate. And they are, in fact, tragically, a lot of them are humanities professors, and a lot of them seem to be white women. So I've noticed a certain demographic predominance here. And the same is true of a lot of the protesters. A lot of women out there protesting, young women on these campuses. So these student activists who have said terrible things in the past are supposedly being punished. But as we know from the Columbia case that you cited, John, they did come back. They claim he's suspended. They claim he's banned. But the next day he's back, literally thumbing his nose at the administrators that said they've taken care of it. So they are not
once he
facing
gets
consequences.
in, because he can get in through a back door. They have the gates.
Although media can't get in.
Yeah, but somebody can get him in. You just open the door and let him in, and then he comes on campus, and they of course have no way to apprehend him,
right?
Because they are negotiating.
Yeah,
with the
well, that's the other thing.
Amazingly spontaneous organizations that have sprung up, issuing multi-page rules for this wonderful spontaneous outpouring of support for the suffering Palestinian people. Now, Adam White, am I right that you are a Harvard graduate?
Well, I went to the law school, but
that's what I mean. Now,
but as Harvard Mansfield would point out, going to the law school does not make you a Harvard man.
Okay, it may not make you a Harvard man, but of course, one of the original moments in the post-60s era of a scene that involved occupations and fights and things inside the halls of academe came in the early 1990s, when at Harvard Law School there was a gigantic kerfuffle over how the law school was a colonialist oppressor organization that wasn't elevating black people enough. And there were terrible, people occupied the law school building, and there were different camps. And somebody wrote a piece called Beirut on the Charles.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, there was a whole book about this era. Actually, it was a little too sympathetic to the protesters for my taste. It was called Poisoned Ivy, and it documented, among other things, the occupation of the late Charles Freed's office at the law school. Actually, with cameo appearances in that book by Barack Obama and Paul Clement.
Charles Freed, of course, ended up, he was interesting because his office was occupied in part because he was a Solicitor General to Ronald Reagan, and then spent the last 30 years of his life pretending that he hadn't been the Solicitor General to Ronald Reagan, and just simply caved to the general opinion at his law school to buy peace because he was so traumatized by what happened in his office. But I'm saying this has a long, long history that isn't just from the 60s and is about leftists saying conservative ideas or ideas that we don't like have no place on this campus, and we are not going to allow them to be articulated if we have any ability to prevent their articulation.
Yeah, John, and the other important tie-in with the Harvard protest is that really was the first flourishing of the original critical race theory movement in legal academia in the 80s on the heels of critical legal studies. So it actually is pretty tightly connected to what we're seeing now.
Anyway, so it's an interesting fact that you emerged later as a person at this institution that had gone through this ringer and came out, and the institution came out the other side, I think, pretty seriously compromised. It had been thought of as a relatively for academia even-handed place when it came to studies and ideas about the law, particularly after 12 years of Reagan and Bush and the bench having, gone relatively conservative. And this was, of course, a training institution and a feeder institution for clerkships and judges and all of that. And so writing off one side of the ideological ledger would be suicidal for a place like Harvard Law, because it wanted to populate the district courts and appeals courts and Supreme Court bar and clerkships. And so, but that kind of went the way of all flesh, right?
Well, I mean, no, in the 1990s, the late 80s, early 90s protests, the school actually did push back. It's not as though they just let these fools occupy Charles Fried's office indefinitely. If anything, I think the school's administration in that era would stand up pretty nicely compared to. So, but I'm saying
10 years later, it wasn't. I mean, it had an effect. Yeah. It's not as though the school then didn't redouble its efforts intellectually or ideologically to more precisely match what the protesters had originally wanted. Right. I mean,
right.
Critical race theorists were brought on to critical legal theorists were brought on to teach and were sought out as possible professors. And
yeah, they seem to be doing just fine.
Yeah. But it's interesting to me because Elena Kagan, of course, Supreme Court Justice, was a person of a different era because she, unbelievably ambitious from the moment she hit the law school, though she was going to be a liberal, worked incredibly hard to maintain decent relationships across the ideological divide, or what are the, from the Federalist Society to the critical race theorists and critical legal theorists, and was known as somebody. So when her nomination came up, both for the appeals court and then for the Supreme Court, people of our ilk, or Adam's ilk, had kind things to say about her because she was a civil person. And if you were going to get somebody appointed by Barack Obama, she was going to be about as good as you could get, given her comportment and behavior. And I just don't know if we'll ever have that again. We'll never have a person who rises to, is like the cream of the crop on the left or on the right, who isn't in some sense a combatant, leading combatant in the culture wars, and that will be the thing that elevates them. Although Ketanji Brown Jackson was not exactly a culture warrior, but we also have the appeals courts and the circuit courts, which are much more important in this regard.
But it's not just who's going to become Supreme Court justices and judges elsewhere. It's if the leading institutions are programming generations in this way, who is going to be in all sorts of positions of leadership in 10, 15, 20, 25 years? I mean, that is to me the sort of this scariest prospect of all of this. Even when we get past this moment or this horror, what are the long-term effects of this trend? This is why I say that this is it's worse than that moment. The moral.
By the way, somebody wrote us. I got to say, somebody wrote us an email this weekend saying, or no, not an email, it was a review on iTunes saying, not only do they love Abe, but they really want an "It's Worse Than That" mug, that we should make an "It's Worse Than That" mug. And Abe, uncharacteristically emotional, I would say, in relation to this email and to this review, wrote back to me that he really wants that mug too, because it's worse.
It's worse than you think.
It's become his catchphrase.
But here's a tiny shard of light. You're starting to see the trend pieces, like Forbes magazine, which had a piece recently that was titled "Exclusive: Employers are souring on Ivy League grads while these 20 quote new Ivies ascend." So there is a sense, I think, among people who actually want to hire these folks. They're looking at this and going, yikes, I don't want those people in my office. Look, think about the trouble they cause. And also we should look at the pipeline to these colleges, because a lot of these activists start in high school. They credit their high school teachers for radicalizing them, and they get these scholarships for activism. I mean, the Yale Law School student who is one of the lead organizers of the encampment at Yale is on a full ride scholarship at Yale Law School that is funded by a Jewish donor. That's insane. Like so
Right.
A lot of this behavior is actually being literally subsidized through the college years and through the professional school years.
Okay, so this is a very interesting point, because Abe is saying, how this is the famous long march through the institutions question. Like, how do you? These are the future leaders, and it's not just, as you say, like just the top of American politics, but corporations, law firms, everywhere else. And I am now. I mean, I think that Forbes piece or whatever is a very important leading indicator, but it's not a salvation. So they're not going to. In fact, McKinsey is going to say, flag anybody. We have 2,000 people, up for 100 jobs here. Let's do due diligence. Go through their Instagram, go through their Facebook, see who their friends are, see what they did in the spring of 2024. We're not hiring them. But I don't think most of these people want to work at McKinsey. They want to work at NGOs. They want to work at non-governmental organizations funded by the Progressive Insurance guy and Soros and whoever else. The amount of money that is being thrown at the creation of these alternate institutions is absolutely gobsmacking. And that's where they want to go. Now, what do they do when they go into institutions? When they went into journalism, for example, in the early aughts, not only do they start agitating inside for, changing the ideological temperature where they are and dispatching people whom they don't like, they unionize. They demand better working conditions. If they don't get what they want, they occupy the office building. Now, when they did that at Google fired everybody. But if they do it at the Institute for Progressive Values, is the Institute for Progressive Values going to fire them?
Well, that would just be bad optics for them, yes.
I'm just saying, it could be a kind of permanent anarcho-syndicalist revolution going on inside the progressive left. And it's also a way of seizing power to start accusing even the progressive leaders of your organizations of bad conduct, of evil thought, of being white supremacist, or, not, or if they're white, or, not, or, anti-gay activism if they're straight, or whatever, and so, but they can still do a great deal of damage. They issue studies, they issue reports, they do fakakta research that they issue about, climate change. And I mean, that's where I assume the activist leaders of this movement go, unless they move into one of these big sort districts like Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley and others did, and run for office and become the new Ilhan Omar. Khair James said his goal was Congress. That was his goal. And, I don't think he'll get there now because of what he did and how he's acted. But people who weren't as as public as he, sure they can. Yeah.
John,
yes.
I know commentary is not a place for investment advice, but I think
Yes.
you just made the best case for investing in artificial intelligence companies, because you just described why
No jobs.
so many major companies are going to want to invest as much as they can in AI to not hire these kids.
By the way, it's amazing. I was, again, having a conversation the other night with someone, and we were talking about how, oh, so-and-so's kid has this really great job. They do X and Y. They write summaries for television shows on the ones you see on your screen if you go to a streaming service and look at what they do. And somebody said, can't AI do that? And I was like, oh yeah, probably in a year that job is gone. I mean, AI, the entire middle management tier or lower middle management tier of the American corporation was destroyed by the personal computer. Secretaries gone, researchers gone, people who had to do filing gone, right? That was just done by your computer. Type your memo, do spell check, format it according to a format. And that's all going to happen here, which again is also going to keep pushing. Here's the joke. That's where you could have the Luddite action that Christine admires so much in different cases, where
Yes.
at the Institute for Progressive Values, they say, well, I mean, obviously we can use AI instead of having people write our press releases, and then the people with press releases occupy the building and, sit in your office and won't let you go to work, which would be great.
Yeah, the only silver lining to that is that there is still one activity that AI can't do, and that's be a professional human activist and block highways and sit in that's actually
Right.
the job that AI can't replace, whereas it's going to be a job killer for a lot of other white collar work.
The real
I think-
question, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, John, you're bringing up something that you're making me think about this in a different way, which is that in some sense, the generations of students raised on this intellectual diet and trained to conduct themselves this way really don't have and won't have the skills to function successfully outside of the progressive bubble, despite their qualifications or their degrees and whatever else. That's going to be interesting. They're cry-bullies for life. And that sets them up, not for leadership, but for the margins of existence.
I think it's an important point. We've all had the experience as you go through life, like you were at the starting line, right? When you got out of college or you got out of, graduate school, and you were at a starting line with people around your age, and you look around decades later, and there were all these people who were very much a presence in your life, in your profession, around you, and they're gone. They've departed. They've gone off to do something else. They didn't have the success they wanted, or they got a family inheritance and dropped out, or they went to work for their family business and they did that instead, or they didn't find it fulfilling, or it was too anxiety provoking. And I think that is an interesting aspect of this question, as you say, that there was a kind of social preparation that takes place one of the reasons to go to college, right, is that you are not emotionally ready to control and contain your emotions, right? 18 to 21, you should probably back off, either go into the military or at least cook a little more before you have to go somewhere and your boss starts yelling at you and you don't burst into tears or fight back or something and then lose your job. You just need to get a little older. And if you're going to do thought work, well, I mean, if there is no such leavening that goes on under these circumstances, yeah, they're all there. They're all at the New York Times, yelling at Barry Weiss and Adam Rubenstein and Tom Cotton. Are they going to be there in 10 years when AI takes over half the jobs that they were brought in to do in the world of, sort of high tech programming, the website and whatever? And what happens to them then? I think it's a very interesting point because, the cry bully at some point has to show a profit or be somebody that people say, I really like working with that guy. He's fun. I like having, I like having lunch with him, or I like, he's got interesting ideas and has interesting ways of implementing them. He's a really good catch. And not because of his race, and not because he's gay, and not because he's trans or she's trans or whatever, but because they're people I can work with. And maybe they could all work with each other, but I can't imagine that they can. It's more like will end up being the war of all against all, because they also can't bear to be disagreed with. That's the interesting aspect of this. That's they emotionally find it. I mean, I think some of that is disingenuous. It's just a power play in the form of saying I feel unsafe, or I don't want to, or shouting you down or something like that. It's just power, raw power. But I think some of it is emotionally. They can't hear it. They can't listen. All right, so let's shift gears. And Adam White is with us, and of course we had this huge case hearing, almost 3 hours long at the Supreme Court on Thursday on the Trump immunity case. And I noticed that liberals and the left literally had a psychotic breakdown when the hearing was over, because the conservative justices weren't affirming the idea promulgated by the appeals court that said that basically no president should have immunity for anything ever, so that Trump could be tried. This was the initial ruling on Judge Chutkan's request that to have something adjudicated about the Trump immunity claim, and was it a district court or a circuit court? I don't.
There was eventually the circuit court.
The circuit court said, no one is above the law, which of course is sort of ridiculous, because yes, the president is kind of above the law. I mean, the Constitution explicitly says the president is kind of above the law. But anyway, so the Supreme Court heard the case, and every liberal jurisprudence person basically said the conservatives are evil and they're going to turn this country into a fascist tyranny, because they raised questions about the incredibly capacious nature of the claim, either that Trump had absolute immunity, which was his argument, or that Trump had no immunity, which was the circuit court's argument, or the appeals court's court, or whatever court, the court that's under them. And I'm now going to leave the field and leave it to Adam.
Well, you're right that immediately afterwards there was this outpouring of angst, in part because I agree, it seems that the court across the board seemed dissatisfied with both the Trump argument of categorical immunity and the circuit court's sweeping rejection of immunity. But I think also Trump's critics are angst-ridden because the justices' questions about the limits and the nature and the ways of proving an immunity or not, it makes clear that this case will not be fully litigated in trial before the election. And I think a lot of people see that as a infringement of the special counsel's right to a speedy trial. Joke there. And but I do think that the justices made clear, including Kagan and others, that that there's some really difficult questions here, both in principle about the nature of this immunity and also the way it might be proven below. Now, one last thing, John. There are a lot of people, I think, saying, well, this entire line of argument from the Trump team is illegitimate because there's no explicit immunity in the Constitution for a president. I mean, that's true insofar as it goes. There's no explicit provision of the Constitution saying Congress has any oversight power, but it's always been seen as implicit in parts of the legislative power, and the same for the executive power. But I'll just say, listening to oral arguments, and I've tried to avoid reading too much of the commentary, other than my colleague Jack Goldsmith's excellent piece at Lawfare right before oral argument, mapping out all these issues. It seems to me it's possible that the justices, you can find a Venn diagram here where 5 or more justices could agree on a framework at a very high level of generality, but it's going to then require a lot of work of the lower courts.
So what you're saying is that when the Supreme Court rules, another additional ruling will have to be made by the lower courts as to what their finding means for this specific case against Trump.
Yeah.
So they're there to address and answer questions regarding presidential immunity, and then the application of those questions is not their job, unless they were, which obviously they're not going to, unless they were to affirm the opinion of the lower court in entirety, which if they were going to do, they wouldn't have heard the case at all, right? or they might have, but
They might have.
I mean, we know from the 2.5 hours or 2 hours and 40 minutes that they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
So
let me give you a sketch of what I think how this is going to play out. And I'll just start with an analogy. As you know, a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court heard a case involving Congress's power to subpoena materials regarding then President Trump. And the court sketched out a pretty broad framework saying, yeah, in general, Congress has power to demand these kinds of documents from Trump's, I think it was bank. But Congress has to have a legitimate legislative purpose. And so that basically creates a framework. It leaves a little factual question going forward about what's a legitimate legislative purpose or not. So let's see how that would play out for something like this about presidential immunity. The basic question in the case that I think both sides agree, both Trump's lawyers and Smith's lawyers generally would agree on, is there's a difference between a president's official acts and his unofficial acts. And unofficial acts or private acts, those don't get immunity. This is all about what's an official act. Well, then to parse that, there's going to be a debate over whether you just look at the action, like something president did, and is it on its face plausibly something a president can do, if so, immunity, or you have to actually judge that the actual president's actual motives in doing what he did. And then you go down a little bit below that and you say, okay, if we're going to judge motives, do we want a messy factual dispute, or are we going to have some like presumptions? Like, we'll presume when a president intervenes in an election, he's actually doing it for the sake of his own reelection and not because he's enforcing the laws. You keep going down and down this chain, and it gets harder and harder to find agreement. But at the top level, there did seem to be, I thought, a general warmness towards a totally different recent case out of the D.C. Circuit called Blassingame. Had to do with a civil lawsuit against President Trump over January 6th. And there you had Chief Judge Sri Srinivasan. You had another judge, Greg Katsas, who was actually a Trump appointee and served in the Trump White House counsel's office, agree that in general, a president is going to have immunity for his official actions. There's going to be some room to parse out what's in a president's mind, but that really is in a factual circumstance. And I could see Roberts, Barrett, Kagan, Gorsuch, maybe Thomas, maybe Kavanaugh, maybe not though, signing on to that. So you might be able to get 5 justices around that basic principle, leave some room for the lower courts to parse out what the president does, maybe even say along the way, we're going to presume that when a president gets involved in an election, that's his private capacity, not his public capacity, unless the president can prove otherwise. And maybe set up that framework and burden of proof, and then let 7 justices each write individual opinions, adding their own little color to the case.
The interesting thing to me about the responses that I read from, the usual suspects, Dahlia Lithwick and Mark Joseph Stern and, Ben Wittes and others, there is basically an all but open statement that Trump is not entitled to sort of like justice here. Like as a defendant in a criminal proceeding, he is trying to interfere with the sharp and harsh administration of justice against him. And he shouldn't be allowed to do that because what's going on here is too important for the rest of the country. And the almost explicit nature of this claim is fascinating to me because it creates a dynamic under which you have the liberal judicial worldview now effectively endorsing Trump's claim that he is being prosecuted and persecuted in a manner unique entirely to him. And we know from the Constitution that is certainly impermissible. You cannot proceed against a person with the goal of nailing that one individual person because you don't like him. That the standard you would create if you did that would be an entirely destroyed judicial system in which there were no standards.
Yeah, right before all this started, at some point last year, I wrote a piece for another publication saying the easiest way
You wrote a piece for another publication. It's shameless.
I know. I was going to tell you, John. I'm sorry. But saying that the easiest way to delegitimize the Trump trials would not be anything that Trump does. It would be what either the prosecution does or what the prosecution's public supporters do. All of us in all these debates, we always have a tendency to sort of instinctually favor one side or the other. But if we went through these Trump trials with a large contingent of the commentators in public basically acting as defense counsel for the prosecution and always reflexively taking Jack Smith's side, that more than anything that Trump could possibly do will delegitimize the trials. And I think we've seen a lot of that. Now to be fair, a trial of a president is always going to be different. Arguments around the presidency are always going to be different because there's no office like it in the country, in the world. The stakes are higher, which is what's sort of raising the temperature on Smith's side of the case among his supporters and on the other side of the case too. And the immunity issues, there's just nothing else like them in American constitutional law. So you can't get around the fact that this case is always going to be different. But the challenge for everybody, and especially those who actually want to see Trump convicted and also convicted in the court of public opinion, is to, at every step along the way, you have to give the defendant the benefit of the doubt. And right now, what we're seeing in the commentary around the court case is almost as though Jack Smith's supporters see him as the judge in the case, that he's been the neutral arbiter. And anybody standing in the way of that, including justices on the Supreme Court, they are the bad faith actors.
Well, the delegitimization thing concerns me long term because we saw this after the overturning of Roe. We've seen this anytime the court makes a decision based on the law and their interpretation of it that doesn't suit sort of the progressive narrative about that thing, and that is actually a huge concern. You've seen this, like anytime there's a justice who comes down with an opinion who happens to have been appointed by a Republican, then God forbid, then they shouldn't be on the court. And we have seen over the last few years lots of personal attacks on some of the justices with the effort again to delegitimize and undermine the court. Do you think if this case doesn't go their way, or if it is as you suggest, I think you're right, it'll be a complicated legal decision and might send some of the stuff back to the lower court? Do you suspect that's going to prompt yet another wave of delegitimization efforts by the left against the court?
Maybe. I was very worried about that in the run-up to the 14th Amendment case, the ballot case, and that fizzled away immediately after the case. And so maybe I'm too worried about that here. But no,
we should just spell out the 14th Amendment case was when Maine and Colorado, was it?
Yeah.
Both said Trump is off the ballot because he automatically violated the 14th Amendment and it's self-executing and he's off the ballot and yan, there's nothing you can do about it. And then the court said, yeah, no, sorry, we can, no, it's not self-executing.
And isn't it amazing, John, that seemed like the biggest constitutional, at least election case of our lifetimes. And it was just like 2 months ago, and it already feels like it was 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, because it's like one of those things that let's try this. Ooh, this is going to work. Nah, okay, moving on. Alvin Bragg, you know what? Better case than we thought. I thought it was a terrible case, but you know what? He's got making a lot of good points there in that New York courtroom. Oh boy. But Trump is cold, and he looks annoyed. This is terrible for him. Anyway.
Yeah. So. Now, to Christine's point, this is why I am worried less about the criticism of maybe the principle, right? Does a president have immunity? And more worried about criticism that the court shouldn't do anything that slows down the litigation. That actually does worry me. The idea that the Supreme Court needs to race into action, not just to decide the issue, but to decide the issue so that Trump can be fully, tried before the next presidential election, which he might win, he might lose. At the end of the day, the trial process, of its nature, is built to be slow and deliberate. And, I joked earlier about speedy trials. Yeah, there's a speedy trial when it's in the interest of the defendant, not in the interest of the prosecution. And so that basic angst about the timing and pace of the case at its root is what gets the entire judicial system wrong.
Oddly enough, of all people, someone I revile, Stephen Miller, the Trump's handmaiden, made, I think, a very salient point, which is liberals need to be careful about what it is that they want here, because if they get what they want and Biden wins the election, Biden will be sunk by conservatives all over the country filing lawsuits against him and claiming that he suborned this and he did that, and he will have no ability or capacity to say, I have to be president of the United States. Don't distract me with this kind of nonsense. This is a hard job, particularly when you're senile, and I can't really, this notion, the reason that it has been accepted as doctrine that the president can't be sued civilly while he is president is that we don't want our president spending 5 hours a day dealing with a private lawsuit, because he is working. He's the most powerful person in the world, and he needs to focus on his job. That's mens rea, right? That's common sense understanding of how the world works, which has to be part of all legal proceedings. What does a reasonable man think, right, of this, of what is going on here? Do you want the president to have to deal with a lunatic who says, he was beaming, ultrasound waves into my brain and making me, do terrible things, and find some lunatic judge somewhere that lets the case proceed? No, you don't want that. But that's what would happen if the very capacious arguments that are being promulgated by these people who just want Trump convicted or dealt with harshly because they've been waiting for 8 years for him to be nailed to the wall, that what they want. And like all such things, as Mitch McConnell said when they lifted the partial filibuster, said to Harry Reid and the Democrats, you will regret the monster that you are creating. Because we're going to be back in power one day, and we are going to use this tool that you have provided. And damned if he didn't, when he was Senate Majority Leader, revolutionize the American judicial system by pushing through Trump nominees at an unbelievably fast pace that could have been halted and slowed down had Harry Reid not stupidly changed the rules out of sort of temporary frustration, or sort of like in the moment frustration.
Well, here's another analogy, John. About 20 years ago, a coalition of states sued the Bush administration's EPA to force the EPA to regulate climate change. And it was obviously a huge issue. The states won, Massachusetts versus EPA, the Massachusetts wins. The EPA gets into the business of regulating greenhouse gas emissions. It also marked a landmark turn in the role of state attorneys general as public policy litigators. You saw from then on the rest of the Bush administration, then Republican AGs suing the Obama administration, and back and forth. State AGs went from just being, the kind of people that would worry about local crime issues and maybe every once in a while shake down the tobacco industry or Microsoft, to go on to becoming just the central forces in day-to-day litigation over regulation. It's just a fact of what we have now. And the media attention around the various Trump trials has now made one of the most politically lucrative positions in all of government will be state AGs or even prosecutors in red states or who want a fast pass to become a senator or a governor. And so we're now creating that incentive structure. Actually, at oral argument, Justice Alito asked a little bit about this. What kind of incentives are we creating for sitting presidents? Will they have more reason now to want to sort of grip onto the doorknob of the Oval Office on their way out and be dragged out of the White House? Is this actually ramping up the risks of future insurrections? What kind of incentives is this creating for people around the presidency? And I saw a lot of people really heckle Justice Alito for that, acting as though he's the one who's pointing out this problem when he's not. It's self-evident that you were raising the stakes around presidential elections that are going to create horrific incentives for not just the president, but others going forward.
Well, Neil Gorsuch, our friend Sarah Isker, in a really, I have to say, tour de force monologue that she did on her podcast Advisory Opinions, because David French, her colleague, was sick, so it was just her, and she basically did a monologue on this case that is, I we're having a really good discussion here, but if you want more, I highly commend this Advisory Opinions podcast to you. Pointed out that Gorsuch said, we are reaping the whirlwind because, hey, you know what? The logic of some of the things that are happening here is that when the president either comes into office or leaves office, and I think it's when he comes into office, every president is going to pardon himself. I mentioned this on Friday, that it's going to be like the turkey. Like the first official act of a presidency should be, if these rules, some of these rules attain, will be to pardon himself so that he does not have to think about federal law becoming a tool to be used against him either during or after the presidency. And then we are really in a potentially dystopian world, because when Ketanji Brown Jackson said some of these things that you're talking about to Trump's lawyer mean that the White House becomes a crime center, that's not wrong. I mean, that's not, in theory, it's not wrong. And presidencies are always tempted. We know this because they skirt the line, and they're always tempted, just like prosecutors, just like to stretch the bounds of the law for their own convenience. What is Biden doing with student loans? What did Obama do with the Dreamers? Like, this is a thing that when you have power and your power is limited, you want to push against because you really want something.
Yeah, John, I see what you did right there, by the way. I just mentioned in passing that I wrote something for another publication, and all of a sudden you're boosting Sarah Isgur over me. And I've learned my lesson. That you got your deterrent effect. But to maybe cast this in Abe Greenwaldian terms, as I was listening to oral argument, I kept thinking this is actually a larger argument, or maybe a Rorschach test, about who do you trust, right? Throughout oral argument, everybody understands that there's going to be discretion, there's going to be process, and there's going to be sometimes unreviewable discretion. And so who do you trust here? Do you trust a president? Do you trust an attorney general and the Office of Legal Counsel to maybe give the president advice? And that's another incentive effect, by the way. Will the president now have greater incentive to appoint a yes man or a yes woman to be attorney general so that they can paper up whatever a president wants to do? Do you trust prosecutors? Do you trust their judgment in whether or not to bring a case? Michael Dreeben, the very well-respected Supreme Court advocate, longtime Justice Department litigator in criminal cases, he was the one arguing the case for Smith. And he really puts a lot of trust in prosecutors, unsurprisingly. Do you trust a jury? Do you trust trial judges? Do you trust political parties to not just come back against the next administration and shove the same thing in their face? And so over and over again, oral argument, this was really a 2-hour and 40-minute argument about trust and institutional trust and incentives. But then again, the flip side of that is actually, it's not really who do you trust, it's who do you distrust? And all of those questions being seen through the lens of who you distrust at this immediate moment.
This allows us a bridge to a couple of things here, because Harvey Weinstein's conviction in the rape case, his rape case in New York, was overturned on the same day that the Trump trial was being heard. And it's interesting because this connects, as Ronan Farrow himself, Harvey Weinstein's chief tormentor, acknowledged or praised or something in a piece in the New Yorker, which is that the way that Alvin Bragg is prosecuting the case against Trump in New York is eerily similar to the way that the prosecutors in New York prosecuted Harvey Weinstein, which is to say, the case nominally is about 31 counts of check fraud. But that is not what's being argued in the courtroom. What's being argued in the courtroom is that Trump was seeking to alter the results of the 2016 election by stifling the stories of his sexual indiscretions. He is not charged with that. He is charged with a misdemeanor that was elevated to a felony on the grounds that he had committed a second crime, and this is apparently the second crime. So there are two problems with this. Number one, is it really a crime? not to release every single bit of bad evidence about your life, or to do whatever you can to suppress bad evidence about your life and things you've done because you're running for office? If so, who, as Shakespeare would say, would scape whipping? There is no person that could not be accused on the same grounds of not releasing the fact that they did X or they did Y, or they had a girlfriend that hated them and tried to get them whatever, or or that they had a liability judgment against them in a real estate case 40 years earlier, and the opposition research didn't surface it, or whatever, right? So he is being tried for something, and it's not even clear that what he is, this supposed other crime, is even a crime. And so you have here that Harvey Weinstein's case is exactly the same. This Harvey Weinstein was convicted on the basis of supporting evidence for a charge of rape from 3 people. And the idea was he's done it before, so he did it this time. But none of those 3 women, those cases were never charged.
Yeah.
You can't then say he committed prior crimes and bring them in as evidence of his current crime when there is no proof that those crimes ever took place. And the appeals court in New York said, no, sorry, not only said it was bad, said it was egregious, that it was an egregious error. And this is the danger of the trust in prosecutors standard, which is, if you trust prosecutors entirely, they have incredible incentives to go play fast and loose, particularly on high-profile crimes that they're desperate for convictions in. And we knew when Weinstein was being prosecuted that they were using a novel strategy. Well, a novel strategy is something that's novel. Therefore, it hasn't been tried before. Therefore, its validity has not been adjudicated in the legal system, either by laws changing or by judges saying, yeah, that's fine, go ahead, try anybody this way. And we're back in the how would you like it, not that you're Harvey Weinstein, who's a pig and everything, but how would you like it if you found yourself in the dock and people start bringing up things and saying that you did things that you were never charged with to prove that you did the thing that you were accused of? Is that what you want? You want to really live in a world in which there are no standards of procedure that protect the defendant and support the notion that he is innocent until proven guilty? And this is exactly what's happening with Trump. Even though Trump is disgusting and Harvey Weinstein is disgusting, I think Trump is disgusting. That doesn't mean that he's guilty of a felony and should go to jail, or, even though everybody hates him, every person in the world of liberal opinion hates Trump and would like him to be shot, into the air with a cannon and then shot down.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, speaking as somebody who thinks January 6th was literally an insurrection, you got to have a process around this thing. Now, be very careful about drawing too tight of a connection between this Weinstein decision and the Trump cases. And the Weinstein case feels just the legal issues feel more like an Andy McCarthy issue than an Adam White issue. But,
right.
It's without wading too far into it, it's just looking at the New York's analysis of this 125-year-old precedent called Molyneux, and when you can bring into a case, uncharged conduct, there are some exceptions, and it might well be that the things that are being brought into the New York courtroom against Trump would fit one of those exceptions. But I think there's 2 things to keep in mind where the analogy is very important. First of all, keep in mind the length of time between when Weinstein was convicted and when last week's decision came out. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's been a couple of years, right?
It's at least, is it 3 years? It's 4 years? Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So lesson 1 is we're going to be living with the Trump cases for a very, very long time, quite possibly. And we should just keep that in mind, that at the end of the day, we might not get final resolution in the courts one way or another for a long time. But second, and very relatedly, some people would say, well, we don't care about that. What matters is just getting that initial conviction sooner rather than later. And I think that actually cuts in the other direction. It's a reminder that there are real incentives to wanting to bring a case very quickly, especially this case and especially this year. And that, if anything, might give judges some pause over how much run they're going to give prosecutors at the front end of a process, especially when it comes, it's being brought to bear on an election process. Again, to bring it back to the Trump case, I think it's possible, maybe probable, that you're going to get 5 or 6 justices around a basic framework that basically shows that what Trump was doing in this election case is not the subject of immunity. They might even be able to decide 90% of that issue, or in terms of 90% of what Trump was charged with in this case might on its face not be the subject to immunity. But there's still going to be some leftover stuff that's either going to have to go through a trial process or some kind of preliminary process, or Smith is going to have to be willing to just let those issues go in order to plow forward as fast as he can with the remainder of the case. And I think the justices, 5 or 6 justices might be willing to set up that framework and then give Smith that choice.
I do think that there will be a 9-0 finding, though. I think they will find 9-0 against, or rule 9-0 against. No, you think not? Against the question raised by Trump's advocates that he has absolute immunity. So there will be a unanimous decision that he does not have absolute immunity.
So I think you're right that the argument.
And then there will be 18 concurrences and dissents. There will be 18 different concurrences laying out 18 different arguments about why what follows from that is not X or Y or Z.
Well, okay. So I was about to dissemble a little bit here, only because, I think at the end of the day, it's hard to say that the issue before the court anymore really is just that simple issue of, is Trump fully immune for everything charged in this case? I guess at that level of generality, yeah, it's 9-0. Anything more specific than that, especially once you get to a framework level or a burden of proof level, it's going to be very, very hard to get Justice Sotomayor and, say, Justice Alito, Justice Kavanaugh. He's always been much more, sensitive to the prerogatives around the presidency and the need for the president to be able to energetically execute the laws. It's hard for me to see a tent that big. I could see maybe 6 justices around a framework that deprives Trump of most of the immunity here after some kind of process. But this is going to be much, much messier than the 6-3 nominal 9-0 decision in the 14th Amendment case.
Okay, well, you are wiser than I and know more about this than I, so I just think Roberts would want some kind of a 9-0 finding if he can get one. So if it's really weak and even beside the point, you can't see Adam, but he's making a face like he's sucking on a
no, but a 9-0 ruling would have to leave a lot to be decided by the trial courts, and which would belabor the process. And I just can't imagine Sotomayor joining, based on her questions at this oral argument, joining that kind of opinion. So maybe 8-1, maybe 7-2.
Okay. Well, you implicitly scolded me for drawing this analogy between Weinstein and Trump in New York, but I do want to talk just for a minute before we go to the commentary recommends from Abe about the New York case, because it just feels to me, reading about it and hearing about it, as though they're losing the thread. My friend Rebecca Roife has a very interesting piece in the New York Times about how people are misunderstanding what this case is. It's a case about business integrity. And I think if you are a really good, earnest, straight-A student type who looks at the indictments on their own, you would say, yes, that Trump was, and using Michael Cohen, was doing things with his business that he should not have done. And it's very important that businesses follow standard procedure so that you can trust the things that they say, even if you're not mad at them or whatever. This is an important principle. And again, if that were the basis on which we know Trump was being prosecuted, it would be a different matter. But we know that Alvin Bragg said, I'm going to get Trump while he was running for office and got Trump again on an extremely novel basis. And I think that, again, the liberal worldview is going to go through a moment of existential panic, because it's at least as likely, not being in the courtroom, but it seems at least as likely that there will be a hung jury as that there will be a verdict against Trump. Because, they're not proving the case against him. Now, I don't know what the judge's instructions will be, and the judge may do whatever he can to secure a conviction by instructing the jury at the time of instruction that, yes, if you find that Trump was trying to overturn or control the results of the 2016 election, you can find him guilty of kiting checks or whatever, mislabeling checks in his ledger. But that seems like, hi, I'm going to be reversed on appeal, and this is the last case of my career, and I'm going to go out, in flames. Most judges don't want to do that. Maybe he has an incentive in this case that is unusual. So
yeah, I don't envy the juror who holds out against a guilty verdict in that New York case. They will immediately be found guilty in the court of public opinion for aiding and abetting Trump.
But there could be 2, there could be 3. I mean, it's not a good case. And the way they're prosecuting it, as we read it, it's not getting any better. We're waiting for the thing that binds the glue that is coming out of nowhere, and instead you get this no, that ball was really a strike. If you look from there's an angle. If we run it 15 times, it just grazes over the line, and we could call it a strike if we really tried to. And that's not the way people think. Okay, Abe, you have a commentary recommends.
Yeah, so I watched over the weekend the 2022 documentary about the Yankee legend, baseball legend, Yogi Berra, called It Ain't Over. And for me, it was very interesting because as a kid, I loved the Yankees and baseball generally. And then when I hit sort of my early teens or something, not only did I stop watching baseball entirely and lose my interest in it, I couldn't even remember what it was that I loved about it so much. I was like, what was the thing that got me so interested in this? I think, at least for me, I realized when I was watching this, it was the caring about the personalities, actually. Not because I'm not a stats guy. That's not my thing, and I'm personally not athletic, so I don't even I'm not necessarily awestruck by great feats of athleticism. And obviously, Yogi Berra has an legendary personality, and so much so, and I think this was the point of the documentary, that it overshadowed his actual contribution to the game as a player. And of course, as a coach and manager, but as a player, he has this amazing record. He was this inventive hitter and incredible catcher. But he's someone for whom his personality. This often happens in the other way, where someone's terrible personality overshadows their accomplishments.
Barry Bonds.
This is a very strange case where sort of delightful personality kind of fuzzied up his actual legitimate contribution to the game. Also, he was a machine gunner on D-Day. I didn't know that. He grew up in St. Louis, across the street from Joe Garagiola. I love sort of stories like that. And this was just great. It was his family. They spoke to all his family members. His teammates were involved. And it went through his entire career, and it was really just excellent. And I did remember briefly why I liked Yankee baseball as much as I did.
He was the subject of this unbelievable injustice. The year that he retired from playing, and he'd won 3 MVPs. He was until the 70s the greatest catcher in the history of baseball. without question. And then he managed the Yankees, and he managed them into the World Series. And then because of a weird incident where a player hadn't listened to him on a bus because he was playing the harmonica, and Yogi told him to stop playing the harmonica, and he didn't hear him, and Yogi went back and slapped the harmonica out of Phil Linz's hands or mouth or something like that, and it became kind of like a news story. And then he actually managed them into the World Series, but they lost. The Yankees fired him as manager, having gotten where he had gotten in his
this
first year
gets into
managing.
this and his whole long feud with Steinbrenner and his refusal to
But
set
that
foot
wasn't
back
even
in the States.
Steinbrenner, right? But that wasn't even Steinbrenner. That was like 12 years before Steinbrenner even owned the Yankees.
Right. Yeah. That was, yeah.
But of course, in the thing that he's the immortal, the immortal Yogiisms, which are the world's greatest, malapropism one-liners, and just two of them, and then we'll go. My favorite, of course, is that upon being told that the mayor of Dublin, Ireland, Robert Briscoe, was Jewish, Yogi Berra said, "Only in America." That was one. And the other was, because there were so many Yogiisms promulgated, and a lot of them have been authenticated as having come out of his mouth, he said, "I didn't say everything I said." And of course, the third one is the restaurant one, which is, nobody goes there anymore. It's too crowded. Upon being asked if they should go to, Jack Dempsey's or something like that. Anyway, he was an absolutely insanely delightful person, and a war hero. And so that's another one of those qualities, and also reminds you of just how working class the majors were. I mean, not that they're not now, not that everybody in the majors isn't, is from like a upper middle class family, but like these guys, not Yogi, but others, or he probably did, like, the Boys of Summer by Roger Kahn tells the story of these guys, like they finish up the year, 1947 Brooklyn Dodgers, they finish up the year, and then they go work construction for 6 months because they didn't make it's not like they had a salary that supported their family year round, and they weren't good businessmen or something, so they didn't like start a liquor store, which is what people did in the, like, Walt Frazier of the Knicks in the 1970s, like, and Earl Monroe, they started liquor stores and branded liquor stores and stuff like that before endorsements got to be big. And so these were like very much like the people that they were playing for, and therefore relatable in a way that you don't really feel like these athletes today are relatable. Anyway, Adam White, even though you scolded me for a bad analogy, all analogies are bad. I just want to point out we can't live without them, but they're always inaccurate. So, and when you submit a piece to me that features an analogy, are you going to be in trouble.
Yeah, so all analogies are bad, but some are useful. The same with podcast guests. I know, John. So thanks again for having me.
We'll be back tomorrow for Abe and Christina. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.